Welcome to Autism ADHD TV. It is the place to be for parents and professionals. I'm your host, Holly Blanc Moses, the mom psychologist who gets it. We dive into all kinds of important information like behavior, social skills, and learning. All right, let's get started. Welcome, Dr. Jared Brown.
Thank you so much for having me today.
I am thrilled that you're here. I'm going to introduce you really quick. Dr. Jared Brown is a professor, trainer, researcher, and consultant with multiple years of experience teaching collegiate courses. Jared has completed 4 separate master's degrees and holds graduate certificates in autism, other health disabilities, and traumatic brain injuries. Jared has published several articles and book chapters. So we are talking about a big topic today, which is the causes and consequences of screen time overuse. You ready?
You bet.
Okay, this is, as you know, a hot topic, especially now.
I am so interested in this topic because I do a lot of work with adult clients, but I do a lot of consultation with professionals and caregivers who have a child or an adult on the spectrum or some other type of neurodevelopmental disorder. And increasingly, one of the main reasons why people reach out to me are kind of issues around screen time misuse. And screen time, I think for your audience, kind of, what does that truly mean? I think some people kind of maybe get confused. What does screen time actually mean? How much time a day is your child or adult or you on the screen? That could be television, that could be computers, that could be on your smartphone, playing video games, tablets, social media, being on YouTube. So any type of screen time, what you're looking at would constitute that. It's a big, big umbrella. There's a lot of benefits to being on the screen too. I'm not always wanting to come out and talk about the bad things, but today's really going to be focused on more the consequences, the negative side of it. But let's take a minute, if we can, what are some of the benefits associated with being on the screen or just being on the internet? Having that access to information can be very, very helpful depending on the kind of job you're in. Obviously, in this era of COVID-19, having access to information, especially if your child or adult is working remotely or going to school remotely, that is a benefit in a lot of cases. Paying bills online, having that convenience, I think that's a big component of this. But also having the internet or just being online to be able to connect with other people, or reducing boredom or loneliness. And in some cases, depending on the way in which the person uses the internet or screen time, that can be a benefit for helping that individual develop more pro-social skills and communication and just feeling connected with other people. So those are just a few of the benefits. But if
I'm glad that you brought up benefits, because like you said, screen time is not a bad thing. You know, it was very fun last night when I heard my youngest son just giggling with his friends online playing Fortnite. And, you know, we don't get to really have hangouts and things like that because of COVID. So we have to be so careful. It gives him an opportunity to connect with some of his buddies that he goes to school with. And that is definitely a good thing. Let's talk about some causes of overuse. Now that sort of blends in what we were just saying, that connection with friends. Screens are so easily accessible, right? You can grab your laptop or you can grab your phone and it is right there and you can access anything.
The attraction to just being online can create addictive-like tendencies, and it can be very similar to having an addiction to drugs or alcohol. What about that sensory component too? Like you talked about your son liking Fortnite. I know a lot of people who love Fortnite or other kinds of games, and part of that might be just visual graphics, the really cool sound effects around this, that sensory component of this, and just interacting with other individuals kind of in that moment. So you're getting immediate feedback and gratification right away. Now, in and of that self, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but what happens if someone is on the video games for 10 hours a day, 12 hours a day, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week? That can contribute to a host of issues. When we think of like problematic screen time behavior or problematic internet use behavior, what are some of the bad things that can happen? First of all, like, does that individual have access to like problematic content? Are they starting to get involved in like chat rooms or websites that are not good for that individual? What about cyberbullying or cyber stalking or just being exposed to various forms of pornography, or online gaming addiction starts to develop over time? And what are some of the reasons that might cause that? I think a big factor you always want to look at if you are working with someone who has some addictive tendencies to go online, look to the family. What is going on in that family system? A big component of this, if we look at the research, is parental modeling. What is the parent's use of screen time behavior? There's been plenty of studies that point to the fact that parents who are on the screen and internet for several hours a day and just modeling that behavior to their child, that child then starts developing those tendencies. What is the attachment patterns like within that family system? There's some research that supports the fact that children that have really secure attachment patterns are less likely to develop an addictive-like tendency to the screen. On the flip side of that, if the child has some attachment-related problems, there is research to also support the fact that they may be more prone to start developing some problematic patterns with just going online. So a couple things you want to keep in mind again. What's family kind of style, family modeling? What are families' expectations of screen time use as well? Do they really provide appropriate monitoring and supports, or is that child allowed to have screen time, internet access in their bedroom? And we can talk about that today too, if you'd like, some of the consequences associated with actually allowing your child to have technology in the bedroom. The research is very clear that is not a good thing.
Yeah, I think that those are all excellent points. And I will say, this is never an easy thing to deal with as a parent. As a parent, I know myself when I put my parenting hat on, and also my psychologist hat on. It's difficult. Just the other day, I told my son, because it was time to stop playing, because we just got an Xbox, way behind other families on this, by the way. This is new ground for us. It was time for him to stop playing. And I do work a lot, so I was on the computer working in the evening, and he said, "Well, you're still on." And I thought, you know what? He's right. I was still on. And so, speaking of modeling, I was doing exactly what I told him to stop doing. It's like, no, you need to get off a screen, but I'm on a screen. Now, of course, there are going to be times where the parent just has to do parent things. Right? It's not going to be fair. They're the child, the parent is the one who needs to make the rules. But I did mention to him, like, you're right, I can see why that would be confusing to you. I'm on actually finishing up some work so I can wind down for the evening. For you, it's important for us to get that blue light away from your eyes, and let's talk about when you can play tomorrow. So, I think we also have to think about what we do ourselves as parents when we're telling, our kids what to do and putting boundaries in place.
In this era of COVID-19, it's becoming increasingly challenging. It's so difficult. The research coming out on COVID-19 too is really showing an increase in screen time use for everyone in general. And there's a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about that today as well if you'd like. But if you were to go through all the literature that's out there on screen time use among persons on the autism spectrum, what are some common themes that kind of arise that may place them at increased risk for developing some problematic patterns with this? First of all, I think a lot of the research points to the fact, social isolation, the social communication deficits, do they feel more comfortable being kind of in that online world? It's less challenging, maybe it's a little more predictable. So really looking at that person's level of social isolation. Is there a history of any social rejection, being bullied and teased in school, or even on the job? Those are a couple variables. What about sensory sensitivity too? Do they feel more comfortable being in that predictable sensory environment online than being out there in the world in like a social group face to face?
I'm glad that you brought that up. I have had many patients have told me that I feel much more comfortable online. I'm cool online. I've been rejected, and these kids have been rejected so many times socially, unfortunately. And so when you get to that point where you are so rejected, it is horrible. Like the idea of initiating interaction in person, or it becomes so frightening because you don't want to feel rejected again. And that's definitely understandable.
My good friend and I just did a training this last Friday for a group where we looked at utilizing a trauma-informed care response to working with people on the autism spectrum. And Holly, you bring up just a perfect example. If you're working with someone on the autism spectrum, they've had a history of being bullied, teased, rejected, whatever it is, that's a form of trauma. And I think I can make a pretty strong argument that if somebody has that extensive history of being bullied and teased and rejected, are they turning to the internet or the screen time as a way to cope, maybe in some cases, with their trauma, even though maybe they're not able to articulate that in every case, or it's hard to connect the dots? So I think important too, if you're working with just families in general, screen for any history of trauma. Are they using the internet as a way of coping? Maybe it's a maladaptive means of coping, but it still helps them cope to get through day to day.
I love that you brought that up too, because it is trauma. A lot of people think about trauma in another sense, like if you were an accident or if you were in a war. I mean, this idea of trauma is difficult to wrap our brains around sometimes. But when you are bullied and rejected over and over again, a lot of times that is traumatic. And like you said, that should be an important part of our approach, understanding how hard this is. And no wonder it is. It's not as easy as just stopping or limiting screen time or, I'll go ahead and hang out with somebody in person instead because it's the same. It is not the same. And it's important that we remember that.
Absolutely. So I think, looking through a trauma lens can really help. Some other common things that come up consistently, and these are common themes I'm seeing too in real life cases I've consulted with caregivers and professionals on. What's going on in that school environment? Not just bullying and teasing, but are there some academic struggles, learning challenges? Maybe the individual's been placed in a classroom or a school environment that might not take into account their unique strengths and their unique limitations. So what's going on academically, very, very helpful. Another big component that the research points to as well is what kind of coping skills does this person have? Do they have a tendency to go inward and withdraw? Or are they really good about labeling and naming emotions? And we know a lot of times people on the spectrum obviously have struggles with naming emotions. Theory of mind deficits absolutely are a core deficit in this population. and taking into account any issues like with executive function, which really drives the bus with behavior, and weak central coherence, where maybe they start developing a very narrow focused mindset on the internet, and it looks like almost obsessional kind of interest and perseveration. A couple other things that are consistently kind of pop up in the research as possible risk factors: impulsivity. Is there any history of being really impulsive, difficulty regulating emotions? There's something called inhibition that I often talk about when I give talks on executive function. There is research to support the fact that some people on the spectrum may have deficits in the area of inhibition. And inhibition is really just a fancy way of saying that's our internal parking brake, our pause button. Can we slow down? Can we reflect? Do we understand cause and effect, which relates to abstract reasoning? And Holly, that reminds me of what you brought up with you being working at night sometimes, or working and being able to explain that to your child. This is where it gets tricky for a lot of people I've consulted with. When someone has abstract reasoning deficits, they have a real hard time connecting the dots. So one takeaway point is to always make it visual, concrete, utilizing like repetition-based approaches and just modeling those behaviors in different settings. And we can talk a lot about that too in the intervention section. One thing too, and we can talk about this today if you'd like to, but gullibility. I see this as a huge factor, especially for vulnerability and victimization. There's been enough cases I've consulted on where I see this pattern come up over and over and over again, where the person on the spectrum has all the best intentions in mind going online, but maybe they have a high level of gullibility and they get sucked into the online world and they don't understand what it truly means to develop a really solid, stable friend. So they befriend someone online, they give their money away. I've consulted on cases where they've shared inappropriate images where law enforcement's had to get involved. I don't want to worry parents that that's going to happen every time, but it is something to be aware of, that it does happen.
Well, I'm glad that you brought that up because it does happen.
Yeah.
And like you were saying, we don't want to scare anyone, but at the same time, we have to keep thinking about this as a possibility because it happens more than you can possibly imagine. Yes. And oftentimes it goes without parents knowing this is happening. There are people out there, there are predators out there, and they do this all of the time. They can pick up on whether someone is vulnerable. And again, it's situations where you're sending images because you have grown to trust this person. They groom these kids. It's quite frightening.
When we think of gullibility too, I give a lot of talks on that topic or related topics. I really encourage people to, if you're working with someone on the spectrum, to really look through a developmental, emotional, and social lens. Because what I have seen in some cases I've consulted on, the person on the autism spectrum is over the age of 18, but they're befriending people under the age of 18. I don't think they're doing that intentionally, but they have sometimes they function a lot lower than their chronological age. So we really need to take that into account. And that goes to the heart of gullibility. And if someone
and the impulsivity.
Absolutely. If someone's on the opposite end of the screen and they can start picking up these subtle cues again, that this person might be a little gullible. It starts small in some cases where send me $5 through the mail, send me $10, $20, send me this. It starts growing with time too. Before you know it, it's out of hand. And caregivers really need to monitor this. I'm not saying they have to like watch 24/7 with everyone on the spectrum, but I think some really important oversight, especially if you know the person you're working with on the spectrum is functioning a little lower than their chronological age and they're more prone to being gullible or naive or suggestible or even compliant. So definitely it is a real issue. And with the internet, everybody has access to it now. And now COVID-19 has really amplified it for so many people.
Well, I'm glad that you also brought up the other side of that, which is someone who is 18 or older, then sending images or asking for images because they want so badly to have a relationship. Maybe they've never had a relationship before. And this person, either the younger person either says they're older, or again, they're not thinking past into the consequences of their behavior, both of the parties. And then that person who is older, that autistic person, is now in prison. Now, this recently occurred to a friend of mine, her son, who was over 18, had wanted a relationship, met this person, this girl in another state, and they began a relationship online, began to share pictures with each other, and now he is in prison for at least 20 years. And he should have obviously never done that. That was not okay. But I can also understand how that can happen.
And that's that cause and effect. And I encourage your audience to learn as much as possible about abstract reasoning deficits. That's such an important area, because in a high percentage of cases, people with a neurodevelopmental disorder are going to be dealing with some of those abstract reasoning concepts, thinking ahead, linking cause and effect, understanding how my actions right now may impact me or my family or someone else tomorrow. It's connecting those dots that can be really tricky. And that really falls in the umbrella of abstract reasoning. A couple other things to think about. We could spend all day on kind of like the reasons for this, the consequences, but just think of the screen time. It can almost act like a stimulant for some people on the spectrum. It's alerting.
And also those with ADHD. So that's important to
Huge.
think about as well.
Absolutely. Let's say someone's staring at the screen a lot through the day or into the evening. What happens? That can suppress melatonin. We need melatonin at night to fall asleep. So there is so much research to point to the fact that screen time misuse can absolutely contribute to sleep-related problems. And we know in general, people on the spectrum have sleep-related problems more times than not. We know a very high percentage of people on the spectrum also deal with digestive health issues. Sleep disruptions can disrupt digestive health. Why do you want to care about that? Because there's such a huge connection between what happens in the gut and what happens in the brain, that gut-brain health connection. Very important. What happens if the person on the spectrum is also diagnosed with ADHD, kind of what you mentioned, or anxiety or depression, or has some ADHD-like symptoms? Screen time misuse, and if they're chronically sleep deprived, can almost mimic ADHD-like symptoms. So maybe they don't have ADHD, maybe they're just chronically sleep deprived and they're dealing with a host of other issues. So don't always jump to the conclusion too, if you are working with someone that has a lot of inattentiveness or concentration issues or impulsivity, have you ever dug deeper? Maybe they're misusing the screen, maybe they're sleep deprived, maybe they're just very fatigued. And then emotional regulation issues, that's huge. I hear this often from caregivers. When I'm trying to get my child off the screen, that transition time, they become irritable, they become more just aggressive in some cases. I've heard that. It's really, yeah, I mean, it's those transition periods too. And we'll talk about some tips in one of our next segments. And again, you really got to look through that executive function lens. What's going on with executive functioning? That's the CEO of the brain. Cognitive flexibility problems are a classic hallmark deficit of people with FASD, and cognitive inflexibility really relates to adaptability and transitioning and kind of going with the flow. Just extensive screen time misuse in general, if you don't have autism, can impact those executive functioning capabilities. Now you throw autism in the mix, a lot of these things can just become exacerbated. So we could go deeper into that, Holly, if you'd like.
There are so many things that we can talk about. So we're going to have you back and talk about some other topics as well, especially some ones that you've already mentioned. You mentioned earlier while we were talking about the concerns and the research out on having screen time alone in their rooms. So let's talk about that.
I want to always be sensitive to caregivers. And I talk to lots of caregivers and professionals about this very topic. The research is very, very clear. If the child has technology in the bedroom, so they have access to their phone, the internet, their tablets at night or through the day, all day long, increases in sleep problems are typically higher. Daytime fatigue then the next day, which you can about imagine can impact their school performance. It can impact motivation. So if you notice your child really struggles with motivational deficits and they have a hard time kind of getting going and sticking with a plan, look into that. Is there technology in the bedroom? Huge link between technology in the bedroom for a child and increases in obesity. Why is that? Because screen time use can actually trigger a low-grade inflammatory response. It can throw off your sleep cycle. People who are chronically sleep deprived might be more prone to becoming obese. They're living more of a sedentary lifestyle, so you're not getting more movement, not burning as many calories. Are they more likely to have access to then sexual content? The research is pretty clear on this too, that children who have access to technology in their bedrooms, especially when it is not supervised, may be more likely to be looking at pornography at a younger age. It can interfere with their level of creativity and problem solving and contribute to an increase in worry and anxiety and depression and irritability, and the list goes on. So hopefully those things alone convince caregivers to get the technology out of the bedroom. Now, technology, again, is not a bad thing, but if the child is allowed to have access to technology all day long, whenever they want, and they're watching things up until bedtime, not good things can happen in a lot of cases.
I think that is really important to understand, because when we think we've had the talks, right? We've talked to our kids, we have explained the dangers of talking to others that you don't know, and also the dangers of pornography and how those can have a negative impact on your relationships, and also very dangerous, obviously, for lots of other reasons, because people will convince children to take pictures of themselves. It gets really tricky. So it's beyond having those conversations. What can also happen, which is scary, is that people will, again, pretend to be other people. They'll pretend to be kids. So sometimes you'll hear, oh, no, it's just a kid. Or it's just a kid at my school. Sometimes the children really think that because they're being told that.
And that goes right to the heart of gullibility, but also naivete. When you study gullibility, you have to understand naivete. And if you're not familiar with like naivete, typically that's when a person maybe's had lack of experience in life. They lack that wisdom, they lack the judgment, maybe they lack some cognitive sophistication where they just always believe things on face value. And then you have to understand the topic of acquiescence. And basically, acquiescence is kind of yassing, where the person just agrees with everything. They're overly compliant. And if someone asks them to do something, okay, no problem. Here, I'll send you this image. I'll send you this money. So you got to understand gullibility, acquiescence, naivete, compliance. They all kind of work hand in hand in a lot of cases, and they can be a real recipe for disaster in some cases, unfortunately.
It really can be. And also, people pretending not only to be kids, but also people working together. And I think that's important to understand too. Sometimes girls or women will also be working with a man who will come in later after that girl or woman had gained that child's trust. And again, I am not, you and I are not trying to scare people, but these things happen. Yes. They happen because it's very easy to be very busy as a parent. I know I am a very, very busy parent myself. Here saying, hey, who are you talking to? Oh, it's a friend from school. that's maybe what they're thinking because that's what they've been told. And then again, that relationship builds, that trust builds, there's grooming there. And then you have a very dangerous situation.
Fact check and verify. And what you're saying, Holly, these are cases I have consulted on. They're real. Can I share one case with you in the group? There's a case I consulted on a while ago. This was an adult male on the autism spectrum, higher functioning, so higher IQ, but lower level of adaptive functioning. Adaptive functioning is how that person functions in day-to-day life, like independent living skills. Where he had good expressive language, he was very good about being able to chat with people. He knew lots of facts. In the short term, if people didn't really understand the subtle nuances of some of his limitations, he could have pulled the wool over some people's eyes that he had a lot more competency than what he really did. He was insightful enough with screen time, and he admitted he absolutely had a screen time addiction. And he indicated that it really sacrificed precious time with his family. So it really just took away time from family, from real friends. He became friends with people online that he never knew, never met, never talked to other than in the chat room. But in his mind, he thought they were best friends. He said that he got lost in it where time just started vanishing. Like, what does an hour truly feel like? If you are a parent and you say to the child or an adult, you have an hour online, time can be an abstract concept. Define what time is, define the beginning, define the middle, define the end. Utilizing timers can be helpful. We'll talk a lot of strategies in the next segment. He absolutely dealt with sleep issues. He started putting on more weight because he was just sitting all the time. He wasn't eating healthy food, so he was starting to drink a lot of caffeinated beverages and sugary and processed foods, and that contributed to some other issues. And it really took on an addictive tendency, and he started to ruminate, he said, started to develop like ADHD-like symptoms, even though he didn't have true ADHD. But he did say he got sucked into there because it helped him escape reality. And he dealt with a lot of communication deficits and in that social realm. He really struggled with pragmatic language abilities, like how to start a conversation, how to end a conversation, and it led to a lot of breakdowns in relationships. He had some issues holding a job because I think the employers and his coworkers truly didn't understand autism. So unfortunately, in some cases, it led to some conflict on the job. And this contributed to some more isolation. Thankfully, he got some support services. The professionals involved received some education, and things turned around when people started implementing some best practices. But those were just a few things that one person on the spectrum dealt with. And these are consistent themes that I regularly hear from caregivers or professionals when they're working with someone on the spectrum that's starting to have some of these addictive-like tendencies to the screen and to the internet.
Definitely. It really can impact everything. One personal example that happened yesterday, just last night, so this is timely that we're talking about it, like you were giving the information on how this can impact relationships, even within our family. So I was busy as usual painting my office last night. And our schedule was a little bit off. So my husband had gotten home probably about 20 minutes after me because he had to go pick up our other son. I got home. So we had about 20 minutes. Our youngest son wanted access to the Xbox, which was within his time window to have it. I did not know the password because, again, we just got it. So instead, we played catch. We threw the tennis ball in the house. Don't do that, most people, because we did knock over some things. Our dog went back and forth trying to get it. We had so much fun. We were counting how many times we could catch it. We tried to catch it with one hand. We would not have done that if he was on the Xbox and I had known the password.
Huge, excellent interventions. I mean, talk lots of interventions in the next segment, but anything you can do to help the person minimize the screen time, particularly in the evening hours, on average, better things will happen for that person the next day. Never 100%, but the research also supports the fact, I'll leave you with this, with just one more kind of small group of things to keep in mind. We know that obviously people on the spectrum are going to be dealing with those social communication deficits. The research shows that extensive screen time misuse can contribute to even greater increases in those deficits. So it's been shown to impact eye contact. We know eye contact in people with autism can be unusual sometimes. So it can have a negative impact on eye contact. Difficulty reading facial expressions and body language. It can contribute to lower levels of empathy, and it can really have a negative impact on language and communication development above and beyond the diagnosis of autism on itself. So just think of screen time misuse as almost an accelerant, where it can just make the underlying symptoms even worse in some cases. The flip side of that, if you can minimize it and teach these appropriate structures and supports, hopefully it can bring those symptoms down to a more manageable level. Again, everyone is very different, but I'll give your audience a lot of ideas and suggestions during our next recording about that.
And I'm excited to be speaking with you in our next episode on interventions and strategies, because there really is a balance. At the beginning of our talk, we were talking about the benefits of screen time, and there absolutely are benefits. So we are not saying cut off screen time, everybody. We are not saying that. My own kids get screen time. It can be a positive experience, but we also talked about the consequences. We talked about safety. We talked about how it can actually have a negative impact on them in lots of ways, not only mental health, social health, and their physical health. You had brought up some important information about that as well. So make sure to tune in for our next episode where we talk about what do we do about it. We're going to dive into how do we make this better for our kids and our clients. So, Jared, thank you so much for coming on and talking with us today. This has been incredibly helpful. And I know our watchers and listeners are going to want to know more about you. So how do they do that?
Yeah, thank you again, Holly, for having me on. If people have any questions about any of the topics that I spoke about today, feel free to send me an email to Jared, Jerrod, 01234, Brown, Brown, the @ symbol, and then the word live, like live on TV, live.com. I have tons of resources on these topics. I consult on these topics. I give trainings on the topics, publish on related topics. So reach out. I will always get back to someone who definitely reaches out about these important and complex topics.
And I'll make sure that I include your email in the show notes as well. That's very generous of you. So thank you so much. And we'll be talking about interventions next time.
Thank you again so much for having me on.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining me today. Don't forget to click that subscribe button so you don't miss any future episodes. If you like this episode, please share it with someone. It may just be what they need to watch today. If you're a parent, I'd love if you came on over and joined our Facebook group, Autism ADHD Group for Parents. If you're a therapist or educator, come on over to our group, Autism ADHD Group for Therapists and Educators. You're going to find those links right down there in the notes. Thanks so much, and I can't wait to see you in the next episode.
All content provided is protected under applicable copyright, patent, trademark, and other proprietary rights. All content is provided for informational and educational purposes only. No content is intended to be a substitute for professional medical or psychological diagnosis, advice, or treatment. Information provided does not create an agreement for service between Holly Blanc Moses, Crossvine Clinical Group, the interviewee, Holly Blanc Moses LLC, and the recipient. Consult your physician regarding the applicability of any opinions or recommendations with respect to your symptoms or medical condition or the symptoms or medical condition of your family member. Children or adults who show signs of dangerous behavior toward themselves and or others should be placed immediately under the care of a qualified professional.